The news broke just before dawn. Across the Sahel, radios crackled, televisions flickered, and phone screens lit up with one headline: AES under sanctions. West freezes assets of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The decision, made overnight in Washington and Brussels, was justified as a response to anti-democratic activity. But, for the people of the Sahel, it was nothing short of economic warfare. In Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré received the alert before sunrise. Reports flooded his desk. Foreign aid suspended. Development loans frozen. Banking transfers blocked. The IMF issued an emergency statement declaring AES nations financially non-compliant, effectively isolating them from global trade. Western officials hoped the shock would be enough to force the alliance to crumble. But they had underestimated what the Sahel had become. Only 2 years earlier, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger had stood divided. 3 fragile nations struggling under terrorism, poverty, and external pressure. But through shared struggle, they had united under the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, a pact built not on convenience, but survival. Now the alliance faced its biggest test yet. In the streets of Niamey, crowds gathered before government buildings, chanting against the sanctions. In Bamako, traders closed their stalls not in protest, but in solidarity. And in Ouagadougou, hundreds marched with placards reading, "We own our gold. We feed our people. We owe nothing." The Western response, meant to divide, was uniting them instead. The sanctions were sweeping. 4.3 billion in development aid suspended, gold exports to Europe restricted, international payments through SWIFT temporarily frozen, IMF credit lines cancelled until further notice. European newspapers called it a necessary correction. American media called it a warning, but African voices online called it what it was: punishment for independence. One popular Burkinabe journalist wrote on X, "When you obey the West, they call you a partner. When you disobey, they call you a threat." Inside the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, advisors debated their next move. Some urged caution. "Mr. President," one minister said, "without IMF access, we risk inflation, shortages, a humanitarian crisis." Another spoke with quiet fire. "They want us to panic. If we give in now, everything we've built dies." Traoré listened in silence. On his desk lay a document stamped, "Confidential, IMF Policy Directive." It outlined the terms Western powers wanted in exchange for lifting the sanctions. 1. AES must halt gold-backed currency plans. 2. AES must reopen foreign military bases for security cooperation. 3. AES must reaffirm commitment to IMF oversight. He read the last line twice. Then he closed the file and said calmly, "They are not negotiating. They are threatening." He stood looking out at the city through tall windows. "If they think sanctions will starve us back into submission, they have forgotten who we are. We've lived through worse, and we survived without them." That same evening, Traoré made a decision. He summoned his cabinet, ordered national television crews to prepare a live broadcast, and sent formal messages to Mali and Niger. "Tomorrow we will speak, not as 3 governments, but as one voice." The announcement spread like wildfire. Across Africa, anticipation built. Social media buzzed with rumors. Would Traoré surrender? Would AES bend? In Paris and Washington, diplomats watched nervously. Intelligence reports warned that a single fiery speech from Traoré could ignite a continental movement, one that even sanctions couldn't stop. As night fell over Ouagadougou, the city hummed with electricity. People crowded cafes, markets, and rooftops waiting for the broadcast. At 8:01 p.m. sharp, every channel cut to a single image: the red, green, and gold flag of Burkina Faso. Moments later, Traoré appeared, calm, unshaken, eyes steady as a soldier's. The world held its breath. Camera zooms in. The hall is silent except for the hum of microphones. "My brothers and sisters of Africa, citizens of the Sahel, and to the world that watches us tonight, I speak to you not in anger, but in truth. In the last 24 hours, Western powers have declared sanctions against our nations. They have frozen our funds, blocked our gold, and silenced our accounts. They call it a measure for democracy and stability. But I ask, since when did colonizers become guardians of democracy? These sanctions are not about democracy. They are about control. When Africa begins to rise, they call it rebellion. When we speak of independence, they call it instability. When we trade among ourselves, they call it isolation. Let me be clear. The AES Alliance will not surrender. They have frozen our money, but they cannot freeze our spirit. They have blocked our trade, but they cannot block our unity. They have silenced their media, but they cannot silence a generation that has awakened. The West believes that Africa cannot live without their systems. The IMF, the World Bank, the loans that come wrapped in conditions. But we have learned the truth. Every dollar they lend us returns to them tenfold. Every project they fund is another chain around our economy. They fear what we are building, a system that values African gold more than Western approval. They fear the African Monetary Fund, our project to finance Africa with African resources. They fear the Sahel Gold Reserve, which will anchor our currency not in paper, but in the soil of our ancestors. They call us radicals. But the only radical act is refusing to kneel. For years they told us we were too poor to stand alone. But if we are poor, it is because our wealth was taken. If we are underdeveloped, it is because our development was designed to serve others. Now that we choose to build our own institutions, they sanction us. But let me tell you this. Sanctions have never stopped Africa's heartbeat. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger will adapt. We will trade in gold, not dollars. We will cooperate with nations who see us as equals, not clients. We will feed our people with African hands and defend our soil with African courage. To the IMF, I say this: Africa owes you nothing. You have collected your interests in our suffering. You have built your skyscrapers from our debt. The era of financial slavery is over. To the Western governments that believe they can starve us into obedience, you are too late. The chains you forged have rusted. The minds you tried to colonize have awakened. Africa has changed. The Sahel has changed. We are no longer the audience of history. We are the authors. And to the African nations watching this broadcast, I say, do not wait until they sanction you too. Stand up now, join us. Together we are stronger than their sanctions, stronger than their systems, stronger than their fear. We are building a future where Africa trades in its own name, speaks in its own voice, and decides its own destiny. The world says we are isolated. But the truth is, we are independent. We are open to partnership, but not to domination. We welcome cooperation, but not control. If you come with respect, we open our doors. If you come with threats, we close them. Africa is not leaving the world. Africa is leading itself. When they freeze our accounts, we will mine our gold. When they ban our exports, we will refine them at home. When they silence our media, we will speak through our people. The Sahel stands firm. Burkina Faso stands proud. And the AES stands unbroken. This is our message to the world. You cannot sanction freedom. Let history record that when the world turned its back, Africa finally faced forward. He pauses, eyes burning with resolve. My people, this is not a time for fear. This is a time for unity. Let them cut us off. We will grow stronger together. Let them call us defiant. We will call ourselves free. Africa's hour has come. And nothing, not sanctions, not threats, not lies, will stop it. The hall erupts in applause. Outside, thousands cheer as drums echo across the city. The words, "We cannot be sanctioned," flash across screens in Ouagadougou, Bamako, and Niamey. That night, the speech was replayed across Africa, on phones, radios, and televisions. By morning, headlines around the world carried the same line. Traoré to the West, you cannot sanction freedom. The morning after Ibrahim Traoré's defiant address, the world's news cycle erupted like a storm. From Washington to Paris, analysts crowded television studios. Diplomats hurried into closed-door meetings, and financial markets rippled with uncertainty. The headlines told the story in competing tones of outrage and fascination. Traoré challenges IMF authority. Sahel defies the West. The gold-backed revolt. In Brussels, the European Council's emergency session, stretched into the early hours. Ministers sat under the pale glow of fluorescent lights, their briefings thick with unease. The initial sanctions had been meant as pressure, not provocation. Yet Traoré's words had turned them into a global spectacle. One senior official broke the silence. He has made us the villains of his story. And half the global South is listening. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. State Department drafted a cautious statement, calling Traoré's speech misleading and inflammatory. But internally, strategists admitted that the televised address had galvanized a movement they barely understood. Regional embassies reported street rallies from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. Social feeds overflowed with hashtags like "We Stand with AES" and "Africa for Africa." The IMF headquarters in Washington, usually a fortress of calm numbers, buzzed with anxious energy. Economists debated whether the Sahel could actually survive without their funding. One analyst warned, if they start trading gold directly for fuel and food with Asia, sanctions will lose meaning. Another added quietly, then others will follow. Meanwhile, in Paris, the tone was more emotional. The French president's advisors urged him to issue a firm response. He's challenging decades of partnership, one said. Partnership? Another muttered under breath. He called it what it is, control. The room fell silent. Everyone understood the stakes. Traoré's speech was not merely a political statement. It was a declaration of ideological independence. By midday, Western media outlets shifted tactics. Commentators questioned the feasibility of a gold-backed system. The AES economies are too small, one pundit said on live television. They can't replace IMF stability with nationalism. But viewers across Africa heard something different. Fear disguised as concern. In London, think tanks warned of a Sahel contagion. Investors began quietly reviewing their stakes in West African mining projects. Gold prices spiked 3% in 24 hours. A symbolic tremor felt from Wall Street to the city. At the United Nations, delegates whispered in corridors before a hastily scheduled closed meeting. A European diplomat reportedly said, "If we push too hard, we make him a hero. If we stay quiet, we validate his rebellion." No one wanted to admit it publicly, but the truth was clear. Traoré had shifted the narrative. In a single night, the AES was no longer seen as three struggling states, but as the nerve center of a new African awakening. In the streets of Ouagadougou, Mali, and Niger, life went on. Markets opened, flags waved, and children chanted the words that now echoed across murals and banners. You cannot sanction freedom. African commentators on independent networks dissected every line of Traoré's speech, calling it the Sahel Declaration. One Nairobi professor summarized it best. For the first time, Africa did not plead. It proclaimed. As Western capitals weighed economic responses, a quieter realization spread. The old methods no longer worked. Threats had produced resistance. Isolation had created unity. Sanctions had birthed solidarity. In Washington, a policy memo circulated under a single line of concern. Containment is no longer possible. Even within Europe, younger politicians began questioning the logic of endless control. One member of parliament wrote online, "Maybe Africa doesn't need us to lead. Maybe it just needed space to breathe." By the week's end, the IMF issued a softer-toned statement, proposing dialogue and cooperation. But the AES leadership remained silent. For the first time in decades, Africa wasn't reacting. The world was. And in Ouagadougou, President Traoré prepared for what came next. He looked over the courtyard from his balcony as evening fell, the city glowing with quiet determination. He knew the West's reaction had only confirmed what he'd said. The era of dependence was ending. He turned to his aide and said softly, "They've answered us with fear. That means we are finally being heard." The aide nodded. Far below, the chants from the crowd rose again. Steady, proud, unstoppable. Africa cannot be sanctioned. As the echoes of sanctions and speeches faded into the rhythm of a new dawn, one truth became undeniable. Africa was no longer divided by borders, languages, or colonial scars. From the Sahel to the coasts, a shared spirit had risen, forged not in fear but in faith. Ibrahim Traoré's words had become more than politics. They were a call to the soul of a continent. He had reminded millions that unity was not a treaty. It was a heartbeat. That freedom was not given. It was reclaimed. And that Africa's wealth, its people, and its pride were never meant to be traded away for approval. Across Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali, the AES flag now flew beside national banners, a symbol of resistance and rebirth. Farmers, soldiers, students, and mothers carried the same hope, that Africa would rise on its own terms. And as the sun set over Ouagadougou, a voice echoed across the airwaves, calm, resolute, unshaken. Africa's strength is not in gold, nor oil, but in her people, united, awake and unafraid. Under Traoré's leadership, Africa's story was no longer written by others. It was being written by Africa, together.